5 minutes for the speech, then 10 for the Q&A, and 5 minutes just to allow you to change the room. So if you have any question, just please take notes, so we'll have all the questions at the end of the speech. So I leave the word to the expert. Thank you.
Oh, an expert. Good heavens. I must say, I've learned a lot about the logging module since I started trying to write this talk. But yes, here we go. What's so special about what we do, and what do we use logging for? Who are we indeed? I'm Mike Sandford. I'm from a company called Red Home, and we use a software package called Lockeye, which is basically an internal package which does all the right kinds of stuff that we have to do. Essentially, for this purpose, we're a data processing company. So we grab stuff off the internet, we process it into databases, we put it out into reports. And we do this through a system of processes, programs that run, programs that use the filing system as a queuing mechanism. They read an input directory, deal with the files, and output stuff, and they all link together in the right sort of way. So we might have a program that reads something from the web, creates a file, another program which reads that file, puts it into the database, and after a couple more steps of processing and assimilation, eventually we get to producing a report. These processes are fully automated. They sit there and they do stuff. Some of them run every few minutes. Most of them run once a day. Some of them run once a month. And obviously, the people who are using these reports, our customers indeed, are interested to know that they're getting the right thing, and they're interested to know what happens when something goes wrong. So we have 2 targets for our notifications. We have data related. These are the guys who are customer facing. They know what the data is supposed to mean. They know what its context is. So if something goes wrong, they need to be told so that they can understand what to do about it. So they might need to know that the file contains errors. They might then be able to, by various means, fix those errors. Or they might simply say, oh, we've got errors, what a pity, we'll have to tell somebody about that and do something about it later. Because sometimes the source information that we have is not actually as good as it should be. Sometimes we might get new data that requires action, so that people need to be told, hey, there's a new data item in the database, this needs to be linked into other data items by some kind of manual checkup, so people need to be told about that so that they can get on and do it. And of course, maybe they also need to have warnings of strange values that have appeared so that they can answer questions when customers come along and say, why is this value so strange? And our people can then say, oh, it's because, and they can report that or refer back to the warning. On the other hand, we have system-related notifications, which are basically everything else, because everything else means that the program's gone wrong somehow, or maybe something else around the system. So we've got these 2 classes of users who are interested in different types of reporting out of our system. This leads to a shortish list of requirements. We need to route messages to different people, obviously, just said that. We also want to accumulate messages relating to a single input. If we're processing a largish data file and there are errors, more than one error in that data file, we don't want to be spamming our users with a single email for each one of these errors, so we want to accumulate messages relating to that input. We also need to remember types of messages so that we can know what to do with that file, what we can do after we finish processing it. Once again, if we've had a file which is full of errors, we don't want to promulgate that output to the rest of the system. So we want to do some kind of a rollback at the end of processing. If that file only contained things which were warnings or new data items, then maybe we want to commit what's happened to the database or output any process-related files that need to be output so that the rest of the world can continue to work. And we also want to store messages as actions in the database. One thing that Lockeye does provide for us is a task page, which people can use to deal with a particular task, keep a record of what they've done to address that particular task. And if each one of these messages or sets of messages is created as a task page in Loci, then it becomes very easy to manage that data or manage that information and to have people correct what they do and record what they've done. So, we're developers, we have our own requirements, of course. We're obviously not very interested in having to create our own notification objects and pass them from one place to another, so whatever it is has to be fairly global in scope. We want a simple API, and we want to bear in mind that single processes might handle many files in sequence. In other words, inside our programs, the generic program that we have, there is a loop. And the loop opens a file, it processes the file, it closes the file, it goes back to the next one. That will become significant as we go through this talk. The rest of it, avoiding passing notification objects and keeping the API simple, it sounds like the logging module. That actually does do the job in this sort of situation. So let's remind ourselves what we can do with the logging module out of the box. Setting up a logger is really dead simple. I'm sure we've all come across basic config. Written like that, all you're going to do is to get, I think, errors and probably down to warnings out to standard error. That's fine. That might be exactly what you want. Once you've done that, you then get the logger to send a message by saying get logger.error with a piece of text, and off it goes to the output. So as far as the simple API is concerned, that line's it. You don't need to know much more than that. So within the program that's handling all of this stuff, there's just going to be a number of lines looking a bit like that to get the output there, and that's really about as simple as you can get. If you want to be slightly more subtle, we can create a named logger using the default logger class. And all we have to do is refer to that by name. We don't have to do any more work. It will automatically get created using, as it says there, the default logger class. So once again, at this level, we're talking about a fairly simple API. Behind the scenes, there's a bit more going on. We have a logger class which can have subloggers under it. They're not inherited in the sense that is implied by that diagram, but you can have a hierarchy of logger objects. Each logger object has a cutoff level in it, which says that if you hit that level, or any messages which are more important than this cutoff level will get processed, any messages which are less important than this cutoff level will not get processed. But you can be a bit more subtle and apply a filter as well. So every logger can have a level and a filter, and every logger can potentially have loggers underneath it. Every logger also has more than one handler. A handler is the thing which does the output. That's the bit that actually does the work here. Again, a handler can have a cutoff level, a handler can have a filter, and it has a formatter. So this is where it does pretty things with the text, or in fact, indeed, chooses what it is to output based on the fact that a message that's coming in can have quite a lot of subsidiary information around it about where it's come from and all sorts of things like that. So the formatter is saying this is the information that we want to output at this stage. I've written a loop round there because if your handler is actually trying to queue things up, as we'll see, then it needs a subsidiary handler to actually do the final output. So potentially handlers are also slightly loopy, but they only go round once. That's a little bit difficult to comprehend, that previous thing, because it's just talking about these abstract things called loggers and handlers. Let's put that into what we're actually trying to achieve with logging. One view of it is this one, where you want to start off with what went wrong. Okay, that's the message. The message says this happened. Where did it go wrong? That's going to be mapped onto the name of the logger. So we're actually having we're imagining that we have a number of different names around the place which correspond to places in the code generically, but they might correspond to other things depending on what you want to do. Effectively, the name of the logger is just another attribute that you're attaching to the message, but one reasonable interpretation is to say it's where did this happen? How important is this message? That's simply a number. Critical's up there, debug's down there, and you can create your own levels in between, but there's a number of standard levels which exist, but that's fine, that's just a level, and we can see that's directly related to how important it is. Who needs to know? Well, that's really about the handler. The handler is our communication channel with the outside world. So this is where all that sort of output stuff happens, and it needs to know, or you define or identify within your handler how that's going to communicate its messages to the outside world, and thus, by that definition, is saying who's going to be able to read these things and who wants to read these things. So that's quite a useful little mapping. Let's briefly go through some of these things. The message level cutoff, fairly straightforward to define. When you define it in the first place, you can say it's applied to a logger level, you can apply it to a handler level. Slight inconsistency in the API, and as far as I remember, you can't use that sort of formulation when using handlers. Don't worry about it. You can set the logger level and indeed handler levels dynamically, so you can have some kind of verbosity command on your line, parameter on your command line, and set that up dynamically within your program. Message level filtering, bit more subtle. This one's actually given, the filter itself is given a copy of the entire record, so all of the message and all of the metadata that goes around, or all of the associated data that goes with it, so that you can filter on a whole range of things. You can even introspect the message if you want to, and filter on the basis of message content. You can apply multiple handlers to a logger, as I said. It's not particularly difficult to do. It's beginning to get a bit wordy, though, I have to say, because we can define a logger, we can define a handler, we can define another handler, and then we have to add both of these handlers into the logger. That's essentially it. So once you know what it is you want to do with your handlers, adding them into the logger is not actually that much of a problem. It's admin, really. That's what it boils down to. I've been fairly simple-minded here, and they're just two different log files. There's actually a whole range of different handlers built into the logging module, and they can be quite useful, depending on whether you really want to be sending messages over sockets or whether you want to be doing it through email. Yeah.
If we set a level on the my logger that says my logger is only interested in error, does that mean that the info stuff will never get through to the info level handler? Because the logger is...
Can we move on to the next slide? You're absolutely right. One of the fun things about this is that we have, apparently, this hierarchy is described anyway as saying messages sent to XYZ also go to X.Y and also to X. The hierarchy is described as far as us as programmers is concerned by simply putting a dot in front of things. What that actually means is that the logging module is searching for handlers in that order. So the first thing it says is, are there any handlers which are attached to X.Y.Z? If so, it uses them, passes the message on. But if not, that's fine. It then goes up to X.Y and says, are there any handlers associated here? And if so, it uses them. If not, that's fine, not a problem. It then goes on up to X and says, are there any handlers here? And at this point, it says if it hasn't got any handlers, you get a one-off message out to say, oops, there aren't any handlers. But that's fine. Depending on filtering. The issue here is that the logger does its cutoff test and its filtering before it does anything else. So that if you have a filter on x.y.z which is cutting off at error, and you put this warning message in, nothing else will happen to it. It won't get pushed up the hierarchy. Nothing will happen. It will just disappear, which might be what you want to do. On the other hand, it might not. What's really happening here is that there is now a confusion between the using the logger name as a where did this happen indicator and using the logger name as a who wants to know indicator. It's getting a bit confused. If you really want this to work, as it were, properly, in that sense, you want some kind of way of getting all the messages into the system and then distributing them finally. There's a couple of ways to do that, but basically if you do your filtering in the handlers, you're halfway there. If you only put handlers at the root level, then that's an exact match to the slide I put up earlier about using the handlers as purely output channels and so on. So you can do that. Now most, I think, applications don't care too much about that, I suspect. But you need to be aware of it when you're thinking about how you're using logging. You can knock yourself on the head if you put in too much filtering or too much on the loggers instead of the handlers. Does that answer your question, Michael? Yep. Right. So briefly, formatting as it comes out of the box is just a way of selecting the contents of your message. So you're allowed to write things like that in your format, and those things will appear in the output, and you're going to have to look at the logging module to find out exactly what things you can do, because there's quite a long list. So, we have an interlude. I think that's a bit dry going all over that lot. So let's see what happens if I do this, and can't see this close. Yay! A simple curses game. And it goes up if you press that side, and it goes up and back if you press keys on that side. And we've got little things down here. You might have seen them changing. So as player 2 goes up, you get an up, and if player 2 goes down, you get a D. And if I press a key which is invalid, I get a warning message. What's the point? Good heavens above, there's standard stuff. The point is, this is all done using the logger. This is nothing to do with output into log files. This is about communicating with your target audience. Now in this case, the target audience is the person sat in front of the screen, and the person sat in the front of the screen wants to know something about what's going on inside this program. So the logger program does it for me. The logging module does it for me. I've got some, whoops. A set logging thing. The usual stuff. How big a screen do I want to put into it? Forget all that. That's just curses, things. There's a filter, which I've defined. Further up here you can't see it, which It's just the electronic guys come.
I give you this. So it's very low the volume.
Regia, proviamo con il microfono gelato. Please.
Okay, right, okay. So I want to do all of those things. Let's move on to doing what those things are. Code, wonderful. Class recording logger, which is inherited from logging.logger, is going to record statistics. And this basically comes from the idea that this underscore log method is called for every message that gets put into a logger. So every logger has got underscore log, every message goes through underscore log. So all I have to do is add a little line which increments a counter. That's it. It does, however, slip up over the problem that we pointed out earlier, which is that if that process, if that message is of a sufficiently low, or if that message gets filtered out by whatever means, it doesn't even get to underscore log. So our statistics are wrong if we are hoping to count warnings and not display warnings. Doesn't matter too much, but it's a little bit of a niggle. So again, it's back to perhaps preferring to put filtering into handlers rather than into loggers. But that's really something about what we're trying to do here, and may not apply to everybody, or indeed anybody else in the room. But anyway, that's a simple enough addition to what's going on. Life gets a bit more interesting when we want to talk about playing with effectively metadata further down from the top level. So the subject line, the buffering content and all that kind of stuff. So again, within our default logger, or what's going to become our default logger when we set it so, I've defined an execute method which is given a function name, and it loops through all the handlers. This piece of code is basically copied from within the logging module. If we've got a function and if it's callable, call it, and then yield the answer. I suspect I ought to be looking for forgiveness instead of asking for permission, but never mind. I chose to do it this way. So yield the answer, and we can go around, and what's going to happen is that execute is going to look for every handler that's in its current environment. It's going to look for that function, and it's going to call it and potentially return some values. So all we have to do is to create functions of the right kind that we want within our handlers, and we've now got access to metadata and so on lower down. As an example, let's get into some high-level buffer action. Start with execute all, which is just a loop round execute which throws away the arguments, because at this particular stage, or for this kind of function, I'm not very interested. And I define within the logger, remember, something called flush, which looks for something called flush in every handler that it knows about. Basically, that's going to be buffered handlers. There is going to be more than one of them within the system, so it goes around and it calls flush on the buffering handler. And that's fine, because that clears the buffer and sends all the messages out to wherever they need to be sent. And while I'm at it, I might as well clear the statistics, because I happen to know that that's the right sort of thing to be doing at this particular stage. But actually that might be a step too far. I don't know. It seems the right place to put it. So now I've got my file loop is beginning to look a little bit more sensible, because at the end of the file loop all I'm doing is calling flush on the logger, and that's it. Everything else is taken care of. Okay, metadata override. This time we're inheriting from the buffering handler and creating a new kind of handler. So within the handler I'm going to define a method called setAttributes. I'm not giving you any clue whatsoever about what gets put into setAttributes. I shall leave that as an exercise to the reader, but basically if there is a keyword argument in there which is of interest, then use it. If that keyword argument is not found, don't care. So in use I might say set attributes email subject equals some subject text, and it goes around until it finds a handler which can deal with email subject as an argument, picks it up and makes use of it, and that way I've set the subject text for the email handler. As it happens, I generally use a whole bunch of other metadata as well within the system. Things like exactly what kind of data do I think I'm dealing with, and other kinds of classification mechanisms which come in useful later. And they're all going to be dealt with by set attributes. So that's metadata which is above the individual message. It's grouping messages together using this metadata. And all we've got is a set of more or less nested set attributes methods buried within our handlers. And now our file loop is actually beginning to look quite clean, because we say open the file, set attributes, whatever the attributes are, process the file, call flush on the logger again, and back to the beginning. So it's now really nice and clean. I'm not closing down any logging systems at all. It just all happens. So putting that together, we have to first set the default logger class. Because the logging module is very clever and very helpful, and it creates a logging module, a logger every time you refer to one by name or a new name, it has to invent a class for it somewhere. So it does this using a default class, but very kindly it allows us to override that default class. So that's what we do here. So everything is going to be a recording logger. We now have set log name to my process name, because I actually want to be able to say this is the process that it's come from, because I've got quite a lot of these. So I just don't want to be able to say there's an error message in this file, because actually this file might be processed by any one of 3, 4, 10 different processes. So I want the process name in there somewhere. I can set a verbosity. I'm leaving basic config in there with a standard critical output to standard error, because that's a nice sort of backup position to have, especially when you're starting the whole thing up. Create a buffering handler, add a formatter, and do all the other things that we need to do. And this is a fraction, to be honest, of the amount of setup that needs to be done. But nevertheless, you can begin to see that it's really just a case of admin. You just go through it and you do it until you stop. And that's it. And the target of all of this is that. This is a page website a few days ago. And we've got here a context which says we are in UK BMRS import. We've got some content here which is 2 lines of info, which says that this particular object has been inserted into the database and somebody needs to do something about it. And potentially we've got space for additional commentary here about what was done about it. So the user can come in, edit the details, add some commentary and say, yes, that was dealt with, so we can close it off. So that's the readable page of a task page on our system, and that's what the logging system has generated from that particular file. And that, with I think some time to spare, is that. So any questions?
Okay. The first? Yeah. Close.
Would it be possible to go back a couple of slides before where you define an SMTP handler with a subject, like 5 slides before?
Oh, I know, yeah. That one.
Yes. What would happen in this case where you're in your loop and you instantiate an SMTP handler, you have a message, and you just said, okay, I set an attribute of subject, and you basically want to you want your loop to select a handler that could use this subject message. What would happen if you have several SMTP handlers? Would they both, or like all of them, would get the subject or the first one?
This one is only doing one subject.
Actually, I was.
But if I happen to create, in fact I do create more than one SMTP
Yes.
handler, partly because I'm talking to two groups of people. So if I want to send a serious error message, a system error message, I still want to know file names and things at that stage. So I've got at least two SMTP handlers going. They don't share that information. So what I've actually got, that SMTP handler is what you get in the logging module. I've got my modified version of SMTP handler, which has a set attributes method in it, and because the metadata process that I've got looks at everything, saying have you got a set attributes function, then all I have to do is just call it once, and it will find all of the SMTP handlers which are going to respond to my set the subject thing.
Actually, I was referring to a slide which is after, when you said set your attribute with a subject. Sorry if I was confused.
Where was it?
It's just after that. Yeah, before.
Oh, stop.
Yes, here, the
Burn
last
the
line.
bolt.
So you execute all, and you said, if my handler has an email subject, and then use it. So in this case, if you have several handlers that could have this set attributes with email subject, what would happen with?
Oh, they would all get the same thing.
Okay,
yes.
all of them.
Yes, sorry, yes,
Okay.
they would all get the same thing.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Which is actually exactly what I want to achieve. Potentially, if I want to do something different, I would give them a different name there and define them appropriately.
Any more question? No? Okay. What?
Yeah. When you're matching the email subject equal, can you put some sort of wildcards in there and things like that, or does it have to be an exact match?
No, this is a keyword argument. So it's going to look through keyword arguments for
just
something
email
called
subject,
email subject.
not
yes.
for an email subject that
If you
equals...
want to define it that way,
Yeah.
why not? Because this is a blank sheet of paper at the moment.
Yeah.
So you could look through all keyword arguments for things which begin with email or something.
Yep.
Why
Okay.
not? Yes.
Okay.
Are the loci extensions open source?
Loci as a whole is open source.
Like if you just wanted the logger bits,
At the moment,
You have
you've
to
got to
take the
take the
whole loco.
entire spittoon, I'm afraid.
So if you have an module logger, an external module, or I don't know whether it's a useful technique, but sometimes you have another module, and there's a logger which is global to the module, and if you set this default logger class, it will happen after this module logger is initialized. Is it right? Or is there a way to put your default class, to set your default class before other loggers in other modules are initialized?
This chunk of code is executed as early as I can get it in the process. It begins with import logger, so you have to import logger first. So if something goes wrong between import logger and here, then we get the wrong answer.
And do you know a way to reconfigure the logger already existing? It's just just curious how to do it.
You can reconfigure a logger that's existing. You have to know something about it. If you want to remove a current handler, an existing handler, you actually have to know what that handler... You have to have access to the handler's instance, because you pass it the handler's instance to say, remove something with this signature, I guess. And that's perhaps a bit messy, but that's the way it does it, which is one reason why I wasn't very happy about having to do that within my file processing loop, because that meant I had to pass all these handler instances around through the world to somehow be able to do that. So I'm basically avoiding having to do that. But there is a slight bit. In fact, I've got an extra bit about debugging in the real code, which happens round about here, which allows me to get debug statements out of it in the cases where this setup isn't working, which obviously happened more in the early days than it does now. So yeah, you do have to be a little bit careful about that, but ultimately it all works out.
Thank you.
Also, in this slide, there's something I find interesting, where you define the stream as standard error. There's a trick, I don't know if it's a trick, but I use it in development and production. You can duplicate the stream. You can say the stream is both a file and the standard error or standard output. So this way you have the login information in your file, which is, this is not going to change, but you can still filter what's going to be outputted in your stream, which is useful when you debug or when you program, and then you just forget about the stream and the information is still there in your file, and you just forget about them. I just find it useful, and
yeah,
it might be
okay, that's
cool to mention.
That's a good one, thank you.
Any more questions? On that side of the room? No? Okay, I have one question.
Okay.
Can you use the logger to, for example, report actionable instructions for people that have to, for example, collect information about financial market or about the environment, so they can know where to go to look for something like fires or for stock market, when you have to invest or when you have to do some action as a reaction based on what is logged?
We do that already. That's exactly what this screen was about. We have here some information about some new stuff that's arrived. That happens to be the kind of information I'm reporting on. But if that new information was some number has gone higher than a limit, buy,
yeah, whatever.
then that could appear on here as well, or another action would appear here. It can be linked to a particular user who will then get it in their list of actionable items to deal with, and they can then ignore it as they usually do.
Yeah, normal. Yeah. Yeah, it's normal. Okay. So, no other question? Okay. So, thank you.